Let's rank the Divine Comedy studio albums. Ahoy hoy everybody, and welcome to another album rankings video, and this time it's my favourite band, the Divine Comedy. Divine Comedy formed in 89-90 by Neil Hannon, who is an Irish singer-songwriter. He's the only constant member of the Divine Comedy, where basically the Divine Comedy is Neil Hannon. Various band members are just in the Divine Comedy. First release was a mini album in 1990, which I am including in this list. They then released a further 11 studio albums. The reason I'm sort of doing Divine Comedy now is that I'm recording this on the 28th of August. On the 31st, I am heading to London for 5 nights to see the band play the first 10 albums in full. As I say, over 5 nights at the Barbican. 2 albums a night, which I'm very excited about. So to prepare for that, I've been re-listening to the album, so I thought whilst I was at it, I may as well do the ranking at the same time. So what I've done, same way I did the PJ Harvey one, I've sort of done as I've been listening to the albums, I've sort of given each song a gut reaction score out of 10. You know, if I was to do a proper album ranking video, album review, then chances are some of the marks on these will go down slightly. But, you know, it's just an initial love this song, it's a 10, love this song, it's a 10, don't love this one quite so much, it's a 9.5, and so on and so forth. As I say, if I was to really analyse each track, then maybe there'd be a few more 9s than 10s. But yes, that's how I've done this. I mean, I love 11 of these 12 albums, so the marks have been high. So although, you know, big popular albums I absolutely adore are fairly low in the ranking, that still doesn't mean they're not one of my favourite albums of all time. Okay, so without any more ado, number 12 is the aforementioned mini album, Fanfare for the Comic Muse. This has not had a vinyl reissue. When they did the reissue campaign for the 30th anniversary, this was included only in the box set as part of the Juvenilia 2 CD set of pre-Fame recordings. It's largely been disowned. You know, Neil doesn't count it as part of their albums, and it's not being played for the 10 albums gigs. Yes, so this was their first album, released in 1990. At that time, it was Neil and a couple of school friends, and they were very much an indie band trying to be REM. That said, there's still some good stuff on here. It's largely let down by the production, but you know, you can certainly on tracks like Verizon Fall, Bleak Landscape, Tailspin and Secret Garden, you can sort of see the early talent for writing a melody that Neil has, but it doesn't sound like a Divine Comedy album. Vocally, he's not quite found his voice yet. It's getting there, but it's not quite there. Yeah, overall it's just a bit too generic, and that's why it's bottom of the list. Number 12, this scored 73.6%, so a lot lower than all the rest, as you will see in a second. So number 11 is the proper debut, Liberation. A very strong album, full of songs I love. It starts really well. Lots of 10s on side A, apart from one track. It's sort of let down slightly by a few tracks that still show a bit of naivety in the songwriting. They're a bit too generic, and also he didn't have a budget to sort of truly replicate what he could hear in his head. So some of the songs just lack that extra little something that make them Divine Comedy. But there's great tracks on here that I absolutely adore. Festive Road, Death of a Supernaturalist, Bernie's Bobs Her Hair, Daddy's Car, Europop, Time Watching, Pop Singer's Fear of a Pollen Count, which was the first Divine Comedy track I ever heard, and it's one of the tracks that made me a fan. Lucy. Yeah, lots of strong stuff on here, just a few tracks, but just let it down ever so slightly, but it scored 95.3%. It's, still a great album and one that I absolutely love. At number 11 is Liberation. Number 10 is Absent Friends, his 8th album, or their 8th album. I sort of use those alternatively because they are a band, but Neil is the only constant, as I said at the start. I love this album. As I say, I love all these albums apart from Fanfare, really. And it's got some really strong stuff on it. It's got some lovely songs, some funny songs, some catchy songs, everything you would want from a Divine Comedy album. It's just let down slightly by his weakest instrumental track, in my opinion, Leica's Theme, and just a couple of tracks that don't hit me quite as much as the others, which were Wreck for Beautiful and Freedom Road, which are great, they're a 9 and a 9.5, but when we've got albums full of 10s, it doesn't take much to knock it down slightly. But again, Absent Friends is one of my favourite Divine Comedy tracks. Leaving Today's beautiful. Our Mutual Friend is a classic that gets played regularly live. The Happy Goth is brilliant. Some of his best orchestration on this album. Really strong. It's just there's 9 that I prefer. It's called 97.7%. Number 9 is Foreverland, and from 2016. A really strong album, full of stuff I really like. It's just let down slightly by 2 tracks that aren't as good. There's a track called Other People, which is basically a half-song idea that Neil sang into his phone or tape recorder, I can't remember which he added a bit of strings on the backing of, but it just sort of tapers off and it ends with him going blah, blah, blah. It's a half a song, and so obviously it's got to lose marks for that. And then also, what was the other one? Marks down. And then there's a couple of tracks on side 2, but again, they're just not quite. I joined the Foreign Legion to Forget and My Happy Place. They're really strong songs, but they're just not quite up there for me. They're in 9.5s, but that's sort of enough to relegate the album. Highlights on this: Napoleon Complex, Catherine McGrate, Funny Peculiar, The Pact, To the Rescue, How Can You Leave Me on My Own, and A Desperate Man are my highlights on this one. But yeah, number 9 is Foreverland, which scored 97.9%. As did my number 8, Bangos the Knighthood. This is an album, I've mentioned this before when showing off my collection, and I think when the reissues came out and I was talking about showing them off and talking about them. This is an album, it largely passed me by when it was first released, purely because it came out at the same time as lots of albums by people I collect and love. I think a Prince album came out pretty much the same time, a PJ Harvey album came out pretty much the same time, and it sort of meant that it only got a listen or two before getting filed away. He didn't tour it properly either. He did a few one-off shows, solo shows, but nowhere local, so I never went to see it live, so I never sort of studied the album ready for that. so it did sort of get filed away for a long time. But having heard it a few more times more recently, it's definitely surprising me how much it's grown on me and how strong it was. I always regarded it as the weakest of the proper albums, but that was largely because I hadn't really given it time. So yes, it also scores 97.9. What else did I say about this one? It's just let down by 2 songs. When a Man Cries goes on a bit too long for me. And Can You Stand Upon One Leg is a very silly song. I love the silliness of it, but I can't give it more than 8.5 just because it's not a proper song, if you like. So that let it down slightly. But Down in the Street Below's lovely. Neapolitan Girl's great. At the Indie Disco is a classic that he still plays regularly, as is I Like. Have You Ever Been in Love? Assume a Permanent. Yes, lots of really strong tracks on here. But number 8 is Bangos and Knighthood. As I say, it scored the same as Foreverland, so really they were tied. And number 7 is Victory for the Comic Muse. Another really strong album with some of my favourite tracks on here. To Die a Virgin, Mother Dear, Diva Lady, Lady of a Certain Age, and The Light of Day. Perfect first side. It's the only Divine Comedy album. It's the 9th album, by the way. It's the only Divine Comedy album to feature a cover version, which is Party Fears 2 by the Associates. I didn't know the track until I heard this cover. I have subsequently heard the original many times and do love the original, but this is a very Divine Comedy-fied version of it with strings and more orchestral, obviously, if it's got strings, but sounds a lot like a Divine Comedy track rather than the Associates' original version, and for that it doesn't lose any points. It's a 10 out of 10 track for me on here. The sort of ones that let this down slightly is there's an instrumental called Threesome, which is a little piano piece played by 3 people at the same time on one keyboard, which is lovely, but it doesn't go on very long, and it's a tiny bit repetitive even in the short amount of time it is there, so I had to mark that down. And then Count Grassie's Passage over Piedmont, I think that was the other one I marked down. Yes, and Snowball in Negative, the 2 tracks that end the album, really strong but just not quite there for me. So Victory for Comic Muse got 98.2 and is in 7th place. Bangos and Knighthood was the 10th, sorry. Number 6, and I was sort of surprised how low this came, but I will explain. This is Fan de Sierkler. This was the 6th album, released in 1998. He says... Yes. The first of their albums I bought on release day. I adore this album. The only reason it's sort of worked quite so low on the list is that it's only 10 tracks when a lot of the other tracks have got albums have got more tracks, so percentage wise they have an advantage. There's one track on here which is Eric the Gardener, which I like, but it just goes on far too long, and that marked it down. I mean, it went down to a 9, so it didn't hugely go down. Also, Life on Earth, slightly, that was a 9.5. So just those two, that 1.5 points knocked it down ever so slightly to 98.5. But it's just such a great album. What I love about this album is the diversity of styles. You've got Generation Sex, which has got a Motown feel. You've got Thrill Seeker, which is a heavy rock song. You've got Sweden, which is bombastic, almost I don't know, Scandinavian classical music. You've got Eric the Gardener, which is an electronic piece. You've got The Beauty of Sunrise, which is just a gorgeous ballad about the troubles in Northern Ireland. And, of course, you've got National Express, one of the great sing-along classic tracks of all time. So it is a great, great album, but it is only number 6 on the list. Number 5 is Regeneration. So this was the album that followed Van der Sierkler. It was sort of a rebellion against the fame that had come from Casanova through to Van der Sierkler, and particularly National Express. They left their original record label, Setanta, signed with Parlophone. They'd been a band of the same musicians touring for the last 4 or 5 years, and they were all really strong musicians, so Neil decided that it was going to be a proper band album with all the band having their say in the music. They also brought in Nigel Godrich to produce, who worked with Radiohead and Travis and many others. Paul McCartney. And although there is strings and orchestration on the album, it's not so dominant. It's more used just as a backing on certain tracks. It sounds very different from all the other Divine Comedy albums. It's lots of great songs. There's just a couple of tracks are let down slightly by the production, which are 6 and 8. Eye of a Needle and Dumb It Down, which are both lovely. You know, Eye of a Needle's a lovely song, but it just lacks the oomph that a more traditional Divine Comedy sound would have given it. The same can be said for Dumb It Down. Dumb It Down's more, I wouldn't call it a lovely song. It's still quite a slow song. But again, it just needs that extra little Divine Comedy-ness, I feel anyway. But Bad Ambassador is one of my favourite Divine Comedy songs. Perfect Love Song is great. Note to Self, Lost Property, Love What You Do. Mastermind is just beautiful. The title track. It's a real grower of an album. You know, if you're not expecting the difference in style, it will come as quite as a shock first time you hear it. But the more you hear it, the more it grows on you. It's a Divine Comedy album for people who don't like the Divine Comedy. But yeah, number 5, 98.6. I mean, it's only 0.1 of a percentage higher than Van der Sierkler. Number 4 is their most recent album, Office Politics. So the bulk of this, at least, was written at the same time as Foreverland, and sort of the songs were sort of falling into 2 camps. There was romantic songs about the new relationship he was in, and there were songs about the state of the world. So he decided the romantic songs about the new relationship he'd release first, whilst that was still fresh, if you like, and that was Foreverland. The more political songs and state of the world songs, etc., he saved, and there were enough of them that he decided he was going to make a double album, which this is, and that was Office Politics. There's sort of categories you could fit this album in, but none of it really applies to the whole album. So you could call it his synth album, but that's only about half the tracks. You could call it his political album, but again, there's a big chunk of it that isn't political. You can call it his experimental album, but again, probably a good third of the tracks are more traditional Divine Comedy type songs. You can call it a concept album about working in an office, but again, there's really huge chunks that don't really fit into that. But what it is a great album. It's another album that doesn't really sound like a lot of the Divine Comedy albums, apart from a few tracks. But it's the more experimental stuff on here that I love the most. There's tracks like the Synthesizer Service Centre Super Summer Sale, which is basically a load of synthesizers being played with Neil chanting, rapping over the top. There's Psychological Evaluation, which is a funky little track with a computer doing a psychological evaluation on Neil and Neil answering. There's Philip and Steve's Furniture Removal Company, which is Neil had this idea, having read that Philip Glass and Steve Reich, the American composers, when they were struggling for cash, they worked they worked as furniture removal company, and he had this silly idea for a sitcom for it and started singing this riff as a theme tune, and that's sort of how it starts, just him dictating that into his phone, and then out on a windy walk you can hear the wind and everything, and then that slowly becomes a proper song, which is basically that being repeated over, Philip and Steve's Furniture Removal Company being repeated over and over again, and then there's a spoken bit that comes in at the end, and yeah, it's very strange and unusual, but it's wonderful. Interestingly, both synthesizer Service Centre Super Summer Sale and Philip and Steve's Furniture Removal Company, he did play live when he toured this album, which I wasn't really expecting him to. But then there's more traditional Divine Comedy tracks like Norman and Norma, which is the radio hit. Absolutely Obsolete, which has got a very Squeeze vibe, so much so that it got Chris Difford to sing on it. Feather in Your Cap. Dark Days Are Here Again. It's got a bit of a Sweden type vibe, as in the track Sweden. After the Lord Mayor's Show and When the Working Day Is Done. Really strong. Yeah, I mean, the only tracks I sort of marked down on this is 3 of the tracks on side C. Feather in Your Cap, I'm a Stranger Here, and Dark Days Are Here Again. I marked down ever so slightly. I think by and large they're 3 of the more traditional Divine Comedy sounding songs, and on this album I sort of prefer all the other stuff, which is strange given that the reason I love the band is because of how they sound. But yeah, in the flow of the album they sort of stood out and slightly denigrated it. But yeah, it's my 4th favourite, and it's actually my joint 3rd favourite, because both this and the album above it scored 99.1%. That's Office Politics. So yeah, in 3rd place was the big breakout album, Casanova. So when, after the first 2 proper albums, or the 2nd and 3rd album technically, Neil had some success in Europe, particularly in France, and as tends to happen with pop stars, that meant he also had some success with the ladies, and that inspired him to write loads of songs about sex, basically, and so that became the album Casanova. This was the big breakout. This has got Something for the Weekend, becoming more like Alfie, The Frog Princess, were all big hit singles. Also contained Songs of Love, which was the track that became the theme to Father Ted. Yeah, as I say, this was the breakout album. It is magnificent. It is an album I have listened to millions of times because it was the first one of theirs that I bought. As well as the aforementioned tracks. I love Charge. I love Through a Long and Sleepless Night. Dogs and My Horse is beautiful. What else did I say about this? It's practically perfect. Terrific set of songs, funny and fun, beautiful and catchy. It's just 2 tracks on there. So Theme from Casanova, the instrumental, is lovely. It gets a little bit repetitive. That's the problem I tend to have with instrumentals, is that they can, get repetitive if they go on too long. Having moaned on one of the other albums, the track Threesome on Victory, was it? Wasn't long enough, but never mind. And then, is it In and Out in Paris and London? Yeah, In and Out in Paris and London. Again, slightly down on the other tracks, but still love it. So yes, this also scored 99.1%. It was followed up by this album, my number 2, short album about love. So following the success, and also boosted by On Satanta, the record label I already mentioned. Edwyn Collins was on it, and he'd had the massive hit with A Girl Like You, which put a lot of money in their coffers, so they had some money to spend. So they decided to record a live album with an orchestra, basically. However, they never really touted this as a live album, and it isn't really a live album. Let me explain. They decided to put on 2 nights at the Shepherd's Bush Empire with a full orchestra, and they would perform the new album and then loads of other classic Divine Comedy tracks as a concert, and they would record them and release as an album the new tracks. They also recorded the sound checks as sort of a banker, and it ended up being the sound check takes that were used, but then they still overdubbed some guitar, some vocals, so it's not an entirely live album. But they, as I say, they never actually did promote it as such. But I just adore this album. It's so short album about love. It is full of love songs, but having the full orchestra there obviously makes a huge difference. And you know, it's the orchestral sound that is one of the main things I love about the Divine Comedy, plus the humour, the catchiness of the tracks, just so many things. But it's a big part of it. My notes on this are just orchestral pop at its finest. The only track I marked down was Someone, to 9.5, but it's still a great track. But In Pursuit of Happiness is one of my favourite Divine Comedy tracks. The instrumental orchestral section at the end is quite well known because it was used as a theme to Tomorrow's World for many years. Everybody Knows Except You was the single, huge hit, great track. If is beautiful. If I Were You, I'll Be Through With Me is great. Time Watching, which was on Liberation as well, beautiful version with the full orchestra. All You Need is a great orchestral pop song. Yeah, wonderful, 99.3%. But my number 1, and if you're a regular watcher of my videos, shouldn't be a surprise, because it was in my top 10 albums of all time. The third album, second proper album, Promenade. So this was written before Liberation came out even, but this is a concept album. It basically tells the story of childhood friends, possibly distant cousins, it does mention in one of the lyrics, reuniting, going on a date, and it sort of tells the story of the day. So it starts with the female protagonist getting ready and having a bath on the track Bath. Going downhill fast is the male protagonist cycling to meet her. They meet in the bookshop where she works. She's for book lovers. They go for a seafood meal, a seafood song. As they leave the meal, they get caught in a rainfall, and they run to a little place he knows to dry off, and that's Geronimo. Then when it's cleared, they go to a fun fair and get stuck on a Ferris wheel, and that's Don't Look Down, which is my favourite Divine Comedy track. Then they go to the cinema when the lights go out all over Europe. Then they start reminiscing and go back to the summer house in the house where he used to live, I think it is, and sort of reminisce about their early life together. Then they go for a skinny dip in Neptune's Daughter. Then they start drinking for a drinking song. They get a bit drunk. Then 10 Seconds to Midnight, which is sort of a countdown towards the end of the day and them getting together, shall we say. And then it ends with Tonight We Fly, which is a metaphor for them having sex, basically. Yeah. My notes for this are perfect. Every track, 10 out of 10. Absolutely love this album. My favourite Divine Comedy album, Promenade. Okay. You can tell I love them by how long this video is, but I hope you found that interesting. I do highly recommend checking out Divine Comedy. There's a very good Best of Charmed Life that came out earlier this year. So, was it earlier this year? Yeah, earlier this year. So I recommend picking that up. It's a nice career-spanning best of. There was an earlier one, but that only covered the Setanta years. So yeah, go for, unless you can find A Secret History quite cheap, then go for Charmed Life. And hopefully that'll wet your whistle enough that you'll go. I mean, the most accessible albums are probably Casanova, Fan de Sierkler, and Short Album About Love. But they're all, don't worry about fanfare, but other than that, they're all wonderful albums. So there you go, my Divine Comedy album ranking. Thank you for watching. Like, comment and subscribe, and I'll see you in another video. Thanks. Bye.